The reason why Pride Month happens now is because of the anniversary of the Stonewall riots in 1969 and the Stonewall March. In 1969 in New York, there was a homosexual club called the Stonewall Bar. And it was well known as a homosexual specific club that people, and it had been raided before. And it was raided in September or October of the year. And what happened was the club was shut down. Now, the reason why it was raided wasn't because it was just a homosexual hangout. That's the propaganda that you hear. The reason why it was raided is because there was a lot of underage sex trafficking and there was a lot of illegal drugs happening at that facility as well. Because when you get people who are sexually driven together, these are the kinds of things they do. Drugs and sex and such like that happen to fall out of this.
Okay, everyone, welcome again to the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. And today we're going to do maybe a fairly obvious topic, given what month we're in now. We're going to do the question we're going to try and answer today on the podcast is, how should Christians navigate the very difficult waters of Pride Month? It is June. Apparently it's Pride Month, according to some people. Lenny, we're going to go to you first on this because you've been reading some articles recently on some incidents that have happened here in the early weeks of quote unquote Pride Month. And for those of you who may not know what Pride Month is, it is, I guess we could put it this way, the celebration of alternative sexual preferences and lifestyles, and maybe identities, starting with L and ending in plus, or not ending in plus, I should say, because it may be never ending. But okay, but obviously, and I say this, this was something on my mind, Lenny, because as a father of 3 young boys, and I don't let them on the computer often. We are very careful and everything. But even when I just like I would say I can't even, nobody can get away from it, right? Because if you're going to go to anywhere to see some sights or anything, you're going to at least see some flags flying. You're going to have to answer questions about why the rainbow seems to be everywhere. Or if you're online, just maybe watching a show, a commercial could pop up. Or, I just go to check my Yahoo emails and there's pictures of 2 men together, 2 women together, all kinds of ridiculous stuff. And I use that word ridiculous, not with a grain of salt. But anyways, so Lenny, tell us a little bit about some of the things that you saw recently, and then we'll sort of riff off of that.
Okay, well, let's back up a little bit and let's understand what it is we're talking about, the big picture. As you say, Tony, it's hard to miss Pride Month. Now, this isn't the only Pride Month. This is the primary one, but in October, there's actually another celebration of homosexual events. The reason why Pride Month happens now is because of the anniversary of the Stonewall riots in 1969 and the Stonewall March. In 1969 in New York, there was a homosexual club called the Stonewall Bar. And it was well known as a homosexual specific club that people, and it had been raided before. And it was raided in September or October of the year. And what happened was the club was shut down. Now, the reason why it was raided wasn't because it was just a homosexual hangout. That's the propaganda that you hear. The reason why it was raided is because there was a lot of underage sex trafficking and there was a lot of illegal drugs happening at that facility as well. Because when you get people who are sexually driven together, these are the kinds of things they do. Drugs and sex and such like that happen to fall out of this. So that was the main reason why it was raided. There was sex trafficking going on. However, because the homosexual community in New York is fairly prominent, and because they had a voice in the Village Voice, which was the alternative newspaper of the day at that time, they were able to gain a groundswell. And on June 28th and 29th, they were able to put together a parade trying to call attention to their victimization as a result of the police, quote, picking on them by closing down Stonewall. And they had enough mass, so to speak. They had enough people kind of in their corner to actually pull this off. If this was Peoria, that wouldn't have happened. Mm-hmm. If it was Los Angeles, it probably wouldn't have happened. But in New York, there was enough critical mass to where they could have this parade and say, hey, we're here, right? The whole, we're here, we're queer. They didn't use those terms in 1969, but that then started to become an annual event, and Pride Month grows out of that Stonewall March and the Stonewall protests. That's why it's in June. That's the whole point. And what we see now, of course, is you can't go, as you say, you can't go online. Every Fortune 500 corporation is vomiting out a rainbow version of their logo or avatar in order to show their support for and show their pride in this month. Of course, in all of their Saudi Arabian affiliates, they don't do that. In all of their Qatari affiliates, they don't do that. But in the United States, they do that. And last year, Target took the lead and put an entire display of homosexual pro-homosexual, pro-gay clothing in their stores, some of which was designed by a Satanist, and they included children's clothing within that. And of course, they got shut down, stocks fell, things like that. They backtracked this year and said, we're going to do it mostly online. But the thing is still happening. And what we've seen now is we see that it's not only happening in corporate America, but it's happening in government facilities as well. So, for example, I live just about a mile away from one of the California schools for the deaf. This is one of the state schools that are sponsored by my tax dollars that house and teach those who are deaf to it's upper high school. Matter of fact, they even won their CIF football championship. So they're very well, but they have the United States flag and they have the gay pride flag. They have the diversity flag flying right underneath it. So there's a government endorsement, right? The White House gets bathed in rainbow colors. And one of the things that happened that caught everyone by attention just last week is with the city of Spokane painted the diversity flag on one of their sidewalks. Well, actually in the crosswalk of an intersection. They turned the crosswalk into a diversity flag. And what had happened is people are not happy with that. So some are leaving their skid marks on it. And 3 teens, I believe, were able to rent some Lime scooters. And they were caught on camera riding back and forth and basically what the police called defacing the mural, and they were arrested for vandalism. They can face up to possibly 10 years in jail. Now, this mural is on the street. It's actually meant to be driven over, but the fact that they were intentionally scuffing it up is what the police and the people who complained about it, the ones who videotaped it, objected to. Realize that at the very same time, the night before, across from the White House, there was a large pro-Palestinian protest where many of the national monuments for the French who helped with the American Revolution and things like that, they were defaced, painted. Not one arrest was made. Not one person is going to jail. No one's shut. So what we see here is we do definitely see a outward attempt at government agencies to offer support to a specific idea this idea of pride and homosexual equivalence and equality. But it's more than just equality when you say we're going to radically enforce laws on one side and we're not going to bother to enforce them in an opposing context. So here's the problem that a Christian faces. You're getting it from the private sector. You go shopping at Target. You want to chat with your friends on social media. You watch, as you say, cable television, what have you. If you're a Netflix customer or an Amazon customer, they have a whole series of films that are for Pride Month.
Yeah.
So over and over again, you're getting only a single message, and that message is we have to be pro-pride. We have to be pro-homosexuality. And that's the problem that the Christian faces, because clearly the Christian position and Christian morality hold to the idea of homosexual relationships and homosexual acts as sinful. So how are we to navigate this when both the public institutions that we pay taxes on and the private institutions where we have to shop, live, eat are both offering a message that is antithetical to our moral beliefs?
Yeah, Lenny, I think you touched on something very important. What we have come to is a kind of like a state of paradox. And I think that has happened through the way of a move of the realm of law from the realm of objectivity and universality to a place of relativity, right? That's what's happening. You mentioned about all these big corporations. They do one thing here, another thing another place. So if you ask them why they're doing so, is because they would say, we follow the law of the land. That's what they would say. So what they're trying to do is actually they're trying to somehow get over the whole reformer's dilemma, right? The idea, for example, earlier, if there was a reformer in India, would be considered a reformer world over because they were dealing with an issue that was objectively seen as wrong or right. That's not the case anymore here. And it's interesting why I say it's paradoxical is also because if you see these two fractions of people co-belligerent, right, coming together, you would find a radical Islamist walking and marching with the queer community together. Whereas if they were in the same place, there will be different outcomes. So it's paradoxical in that sense, but at the same time, it's possible only because we have taken away objectivity and universality out of the law and have relativized it so much that people they see objectivity of any form on law as oppressive. And that's how Christians are seen when we make that claim.
I think.
Go ahead, Lenny.
Well, I think that yes, that's true. I don't think that that's anything new. I think we've been seeing that way since really the first century. But what's interesting about this is of course it's going to be relativistic, right? So there's a lot of things that are legal. The Establishment Clause is legal, but so is the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. And I don't see anybody marching for religious freedom the way they're marching for Pride Month. I don't see the schools adopting the religious freedom, work days and coloring pages and such, or film categories about religious freedom. It just doesn't happen. And I'm not even talking about Christianity at this point. Now, we have to remember that there's a couple of things that are happening here. One is the very epithet that we start to see, Pride Month. Let's just start with that. What does it mean to be proud? What are we supposed to have pride in? Why is it even called Pride Month? For most of humanity, we would recognize pride is something that you would rightly recognize for an accomplishment, achievement. Right?
Yeah.
You're proud that you got an A on the test. You're proud that you worked so hard that you were able to run the marathon. Those are accomplishments. They took diligence. There's something of an achievement that's objectively recognizable, right? There's a standard, and you've hit that standard or surpassed that standard, and you're proud of that. What Pride Month is trying to tell us is you need to be proud of your sexual proclivities. Now that's weird.
That is weird,
That's
but Lenny, I think we'd say that it's this shift, because there was sort of like before that more the idea of racial pride, right? Proud to be like black and beautiful, proud to be black. So I think it is weird to think of having pride in one's desires, like sexual desires and proclivities. But I think it's connected to this idea of pride in one's identity more generally, right? Instead of an accomplishment, it's more of an ontological claim. It's very humanistic, right? Like, I'm just proud the way I was made, or the way that I am. And that includes things like, now you can't say it if you're white. Jacob might be able to say it because he's brown. And then others will say it, of course, in this month because of their sexual desires. And that's not to equate ethnic categories with sexual categories, but I think that these two things have been related in that it's a pride in one's human, just social features.
okay. So I appreciate that, and I kind of expected that. I've thought through that a little bit, and let's take it apart. I'm Italian in heritage, and I'm proud to be Italian. Right? That's who I am. But heritage, the reason why you have pride in your heritage is twofold. The first is, yes, you identify with your family, and you know that you had good families, and some of those traditions follow through. So there's a tradition aspect to pride that you say there's certain things that are valuable because they draw individuals closer to one another. The second reason you would be proud for your heritage is because you look back and you say, there are individuals to whom I'm connected that have done very good things. Marconi, for example, in the radio, Christopher Columbus, of course. There are the Majesty of Rome, perhaps. I mean, you can go on. And every culture has that, and every culture should have that. There are aspects of culture that have contributed to the human condition in a way that makes those contributions better off for all of humanity. What we're talking about with homosexuality is fundamentally different than heritage.
Yep.
Because it isn't. What binds us together is our cultural standards, those marks we've left on making humanity better humans. That has nothing to do with Pride Month. Pride Month is all about individuality, self-aggrandizement, and self-pleasure. And I'm not stretching that because if you look at any of the parades, look at the West Hollywood Pride Parade.
No,
look at the New York Pride Parade. You can tell it is all driven about there's sadomasochism going on. There's nudity going on. So I'm not making a stretch here. This is the center of what they're driving at.
No, and
so
I was just saying it's the further devolution of a form of humanism. Right. And now you're not even taking pride in something like human achievements or an ethnic heritage. You're just taking pride in like the most base and like human instincts and drives. Like it takes it, right. I mean, it's just, which is, there's obviously there's no accomplishment there. There's no,
there even could be accomplishment. There could be accomplishment. The Police in the 80s had a hit song called "Murder by Numbers." I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Sting uses this fictitious person and says, once you're starting to become familiar with murder, then you can start crafting it better, right? You can start making murders more complex, and you can be proud of the way that you're murdering capabilities grow. And this is the problem. Pride for the sake of pride is morally vacuous. It means nothing. Moriarty was very, very proud that he could outflank Sherlock Holmes. But that doesn't mean that we should be upholding Moriarty.
No,
Or
that's right. That's right. Because that's a super good point because and it's somewhere in Carl Trueman's book, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's a smaller section of one of the chapters, but where he's talking about, like aestheticism as a basis for morality. And he mentions a 19th century philosopher who starts talking about literary theory and about how, well, murder can be aesthetic, right? Crime can be a kind of aesthetic thing, right? Does that make crime? You think of people who have sort of expounded on this in art and literature, like why am I blanking? Picture Dorian Gray. Crime can be aesthetically, as long as it's aesthetically interesting, right? As long as it's aesthetically sort of like tantalizing, that's all that matters with regards to whether it's good or bad. And again, this is kind of the Nietzschean move away from right or wrong, good or evil, to what Nietzsche thought was just morality should be construed of as just good or bad in sort of a qualitative aesthetic sense. Right now, I might say that I think that when you look at something like a pride parade or these things, there's not even an aesthetically, there is no aesthetic quality there really, because it has, again, nothing to gauge.
It's sensual, not aesthetic.
Pride, right? Yeah. So, and I think anybody who's got an aesthetic that is rightly oriented towards eternal things, and the ultimate eternal thing being God's himself, will rightly see something like a display of pride as ugly, in fact. And then your soul would be rightly oriented towards that if you see it as ugly. I mean, it's hard to think. It is really, and I'll say this, and maybe we'll get some comments on it, but a transgender person is, for the most part, ugly to look at. And I think that if because there's a grotesque sort of aspect to the mashing together of two things that are supposed to be separated, right? And
they're violating their telos.
It's a violation. You could put it that way. A violation of the telos, if the soul is rightly ordered, and if it has a visible component, which a lot of these pride images do, one should react. People will say you're phobic. It's not a fear. I think it's a right. The right reaction is something like a disgust. It is disgusting, and we should say
it's a great place to explore as well. And Tony, in one sense, what you're talking about is the trajectory, if we see, of where we've come to with regards to the whole queer understanding of beauty is through the way of the arts. We've been saying beauty is in the eye of the beholder. There's no common standard. It's not contingent on an objective truth anymore. Rather, it's based on one's subjective feeling and preferences. I think Carl Trueman kind of touches on that as well. And I think that's the same case with the LGBTQ ideology, because they'll always want to land on that basic nature of human being, which they presume to be innocent.
Well,
and slave. Yeah.
And we'll get to Logan here in a sec, but I'm thinking, like, if you think of some of the homosexual men, especially out there, who are more conservative, like Douglas Murray or something, you can see how they really dress and make themselves, they look like men, and they make sure to present themselves as men, even if their inner desires are for the same sex sexually. But one of the things that I would point out, and I just finished not only reading but writing a book review on Neil Shenvi and Patrick Sawyer's book, Critical Dilemma. And they do go into depth on queer theory in that book, although I'm sure there are other books that deal with queer theory more directly, because they're trying to do a broad canvas of various critical theories, or critical theory in general. But they do a good job of saying, look, of pointing out what queer theorists themselves say. The idea that those are in that sort of counter Judeo-Christian cultural movement going back generations now, were ever intent on stopping at just kind of homosexuality simpliciter. Like, that was never really the intent. The intent is to destroy and break down every sexual boundary, every sexual norm, every moray, every sort of guardrail on sexuality. And when you look at the people, you look some of the people in the 50s and 60s who were writing like, and Truman does bring up like Wilhelm Reich or Jean Genet, Sartre, one of Sartre's best friends. And of course, we all are familiar with some Foucault. There was no like, yeah, we want to have just sort of homosexuality simplistic accepted or tolerated. I mean, it's always the full gamut, right? It's always the full scope and range of human sexual exploration and endeavor. The idea was never that it would stop somewhere at some arbitrary, stopping point. It was always going to go to the extreme, what we would call the extreme, because they just said, well, the extremes are they're just social constructs. And once we do away with these, Marcuse would be another one. Once you do away with all of these socially constructed boundaries that were put there by religion or necessity, anarchy in Freud's terms, then we're going to become, and this is where I think the transhumanism piece comes in, which Logan and I have talked about. It's the next kind of thing.
I think going back to like Lenny's first question, like how do Christians navigate this? I think you have to ask, I think, some interesting broad questions. And it could be something simple like, do you think, take an example, that the first argument for the LGBTQ community was we just want to have the right to be married? And then now, 10 years later, it's just sort of gotten out of hand. Like, is that the way you're going to look at it? Are you looking at it as maybe it's intentional? Do you look at it as, like, we really don't know what the next thing is going to be? Or is it like kind of like we need this end goal and we need certain things to fall into place to get to that end goal? So like you just ended on that part, Tony, about the transhumanism. Like, I'm just like, I've been at the point for a long time that I'm like, transgenderism is just a way to get transhumanism off the ground, and we need to do experiments on people, and the best way to do it is to find like a handful of like mentally ill people and say that they're genuinely good, and then just sort of like mutilate them, and then try to get a bunch more people and do the same thing and like perfect the art. Like, that sounds like a very like dark and pessimistic and horrible view, but then I'm like, okay, like, can you show me where this is not tracking for the last 5, 10, 15 years? And we can have a conversation about what that's looking like. I think this goes for the same thing. Like, I don't know, a couple Halloweens ago, I did a sermon on like, what is anti-Christian about the Antichrist? And so I opened up with a clip. Now I'm thinking about it, might not have been entirely appropriate, but I opened up with a kind of a spiel from Marilyn Manson. And he was like, it was at his MTV concert. And he basically has this thing where he ridicules Christianity, but it's interesting because he ridicules it on the oppressiveness of its beauty standards. He doesn't talk about Christ or the forgiveness or anything like that. He's like, no, it's actually the oppressive nature of Christian beauty that we have to attack, and this is why I do what I do, and this is why all this stuff has transgender themes or like blurring sexuality or blurring nature with artificial, just like trying to destroy the constructed order. And so like, is it weird that like the Democrats have always hated, not always hated, in the modern age have primarily hated America? I think America is a predominantly or fundamentally a Christian country, fundamentally a Protestant enterprise. So, and I'm thinking, well, maybe the one way in which you sort of destroy the American culture is you just start destroying facets of Christianity one way or another. And like, I don't know, I'm thinking, well, how many of the prominent Democrats, the Democrats that are in power, how many of them are gay? How many of them are transgender? How many of them are like cutting off their penises and they're getting rid of their boobs? Like none of them. But they're like, super on board with it. And then Lenny made this comment about the, we're these private companies are in on it. But like, if you look at the ESG standard, they're being used to show pension funds where to invest their money. So like, they might be like private companies, they're publicly traded companies. And so when you have like, I think California's pension is like $500 billion is being invested across the, Fortune 500 stock listings based on whether or not they agree to the ESG governance standards, then it's like, oh, so they are like becoming arms of the government in this sort of propaganda, and they're being paid to fall in line, like promote the destruction of America's sexual ethics, and we'll pay you to do it. Actually, we'll pay the people who are against it money for you to do it. Like, I don't know, that sounds like super like intentional, maybe like very like a dark way of looking at things, but I'm also like, please show me if this is wrong. Like, it seems like it's fitting all the pieces.
Yeah, there's a couple of pieces there. I think that there is a new wave of mid-level management that's been moved into the Fortune 500 companies, that because of their indoctrination through critical pedagogy and the whole school system are actually believing this stuff. There's a reason why the VP of marketing of Bud Light blew the company up, and she wasn't anticipating it. She was really surprised that the whole Dylan McIlvaney, fiasco blew up in her face. She had no idea, because she's, first of all, so sheltered that she thinks that everybody should think like her, and that she was told that the faceless rabble will just follow along and it doesn't matter. So I think that there's that mix that's happening as well. But people are starting to say no, and that's part of the issue. Now, realize if you want to truly talk about a planned attack, the whole concept of homosexual acceptance truly is planned, and this isn't a conspiracy theory, because their plan was published, and you can go to a library and grab it. It was a manifesto that came out in 1989, written by Marshall Kirk and Hunter Madsen, okay, out of Plume Books. And the title of the book is After the Ball, How America Will Conquer Its Fear and Hatred of Gays in the 90s. Now, Kirk and Madsen are both Harvard graduates. Kirk was a researcher in neuropsychiatry, and Hunter Madsen was a public persuasion expert, worked on Wall Street and Madison Avenue, and he has a PhD in politics as well. And they crafted this book, and they specifically say in the preamble, in the foreword here, that this is going to be a campaign of unabashed propaganda using long-established principles of psychology and advertising in order to sway America into holding the views that homosexuality is not merely okay, but good. And their whole point in this project was to change public opinion from seeing homosexuals as problematic or deviant to your next door neighbor. They used 3 different specific tactics in order to do so. The first step was what they called desensitization, which is to show homosexuals as your next door neighbor, show homosexuals in every likable way and in every likable setting. This is why you see GLAAD has a strong presence in the movie industry and in the television field. You can't have anything basically airing unless you have a homosexual character. And that homosexual character has to be a positive figure. He can't be the villain. Yeah. So you have to have a conscious flood of homosexuals presented in the least offensive fashion. After desensitization, after everybody gets used to seeing them on every street corner, then they wanted to move into the system of jamming. And jamming is basically silencing any ulterior views. Immediately rejecting those, is calling them bigoted, calling them phobic, using shame words, things like that, really demonizing anyone who would object to any kind of homosexual representation as positive. And then the third piece is what they call conversion, and we've hit that in the last decade. Conversion of the average American's emotion, mind, and will through a planned psychological attack, they say on page 153, in the form of propaganda fed to the nation via the media. We mean subverting the mechanism of prejudice to our own ends, using the very process that made America hate us to turn their hatred into warm regard, whether they like it or not. So that's their plan, is desensitize, jam, and then convert. They've done that for the most part, so that even conservatives will hold to a live and let live atmosphere. The problem is we see the real world ramifications for it. So Gary Powell, who is a research fellow for SOGI, for the European Special Consultant at the Center for Bioethics, just wrote the other day that he campaigned strongly for gay marriage. And he says, in and of itself, I still can't see any valid objection to it. He says, but now I believe it's a mistake. Why does he believe it's a mistake? Because it turns out that marriage is coupled and tied to child rearing. Go figure.
Yeah, right.
Well, what he's done is as he's studied surrogacy and the travesty that's happened with women basically being enslaved, children being bought and sold, as surrogacy and IVF rear its head. He's found that these had unintended consequences, and I wanted to say, this isn't unintended. We were shouting this from the rooftops at least a decade before Obergefell. We knew that this was going to be a problem.
And it was always important to realize that the argument for gay marriage was never to give gay couples equal legal protection. It was always to expand the definition of an inherently religious institution. It was always targeted against Christians from the very beginning. So this is where, and maybe it's, is this like the next step of the episode, so to speak? But when you say how should Christians navigate Pride Month, maybe it's the realization that for years there's been a process of trying to make as many of your children sexually deviant and self-harmful as possible, and you have to, as a parent, ask, what are you going to do about that? And some people, that's going to be the first time they hear that. I hope it makes it more clear that that's what's happening. Sometimes making sharp statements like that, it's oh wow, it coalesces a bunch of things I was feeling that I didn't think was actually one concerted thing. But if that's the sort of premise, then versus this is just a nice celebratory happy thing, but it's more intentional and it's a little bit darker and more sinister. It's the meme that goes around every Pride Month where they start getting upset about the transgender reading clubs. They're not reading at prisons. They're not going to these service areas and war fronts to give story hour. It is only to the children, to the kindergartners, to the the preschoolers. It is very targeted. Well, and you can either say it's just accidental or it's intentional. I think intentional is a better explanation.
Yeah. No, it is intentional. It's just people look what Lenny just described in that handbook that was written in 89 and what you're describing, Logan. It is and everybody's going to say, I can't believe he brought up Marxism. It is a Marxist template for how to re-engineer a society. I want to say it's in Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, because everything's in that book. But Taylor was sort of he was a Marxist for a while. He was a socialist at least. And he was, he understood Marx as a philosopher, but also, he understood that Marxism had these two almost competing aspects. One was just the economic theory itself, which obviously was a big failure. But the other was Marxism, this more metaphysical and mystical Marxism, of sort of Marxism as a human theory of liberation, right? And it's all these things we need to be liberated from that obviously God can't do because God isn't real and all that. And, this is something that I was just listening to Tucker Carlson's podcast with this Alexander Dugin, who's a Russian philosopher who's been banned in the United States. And I don't know much about him, but he's pointing out some pretty obvious things. This Marx is as a theory of liberation where you have to be constantly liberated from one sort of any group that you belong to. You have to be liberated from it so that you can be this self-realized individual, this fully liberated individual. And one of the last groups that we have to be liberated from after liberated from our, maybe ethnic or national identity is, well, everybody is part of either male or female group. So how do you be liberated from maleness and liberated from femaleness to have this fully autonomous sort of individuality, you know, and I think that's in there, right? There's this is a worship of self, you know. It's very simple, put it simply, and it's very mystical and spiritual in the sense of trying to elevate oneself out of every other group or category that one belongs to, especially those that are obviously God-given, like one's gender, right? So that one is kind of a unique creature, right? Utterly unique and different from what's utterly unique? What being is utterly unique? Well, God is utterly unique, right? So there is this sort of impulse, and it's the basic impulse to want to be like kind of your own God, right? Fully autonomous, separate from every other being around you and different in some way. And, you know, the other aspect of that, the Marxist, the liberation, and we've touched on this in Marxist theory, is every voice to the contrary has to be entirely eliminated. There cannot be even one dissenting voice from your view, right? And I mean, this is what cancel culture is all about. Because if there's even one dissenting voice, that dissenting voice implies that you may not be a truth unto yourself, right? Because there is some dissent, and you can't have dissent in utopia. You can't have dissent in heaven on earth, because that wouldn't be heaven then. So you do really have to get rid of every other view other than the one that you're proposing, right?
Well, and I think that is an important key, and this is where, like, you know, we see it in LA, like, and this is just a basic political question. Like, if you want to be elected and you want to stay in power, you need someone to vote for you, obviously, and you need to be able to count on them to vote repeatedly for you. And so what you do basically, and this is just watch politics, is you try to create as many dependent groups on your party as possible. You saw this with the anytime there's a casino, a lot always comes up, right? So the Native Americans in California are a dependent class of the Democratic Party. Why is that? Because they have a monopoly on a casino. The moment the Native Americans begin voting for Republicans, they will lose their charter on casinos. That's it. And you'll see this every time there's a possible window of it cracking open, it becomes a huge party conflict. Like, are they losing their charter? You see this with like government housing. Like, the Democrats aren't interested in doing like free housing, like you're now a property owner. It's always you can move into a house that you're now dependent on the government to subsidize. And so you have to then step back and go, okay, well, how many of these like government welfare programs are nice? And they do help people in some ways, but then like, not trying to be sinister, but like every time there's a budget crisis, you have the Democrats saying we're cutting welfare checks to, you know, the Social Security checks. That's always the first on the block. It's always the Social Security checks to the old people. If you do not get Congress to pass this bill, some people can go, oh, it's coincidental, or it could be like, well, they want a dependent class, which is the Social Security, a lot of the Social Security recipients. And if you don't vote for us or you don't pressure Congress to do it, then we're going to cut your funds. Like, it seems like a very dark thing you would see out of like Animal Farm or 1984, but it's like, well, just like see how it pans out. Like, what if the Native Americans started voting Republican? Would they lose their monopoly on casinos in California? I would guess probably yes.
Tony, to touch on what you were saying, I think as Christians, we need to understand that there is only just one dissenting voice, which is a Christian voice, because it's exceptionally different from all other worldviews. You can find people with commonalities, like even Muslims and Hindus and atheists and no matter who. I mean, they would march together because they're functioning on that basic premise, right? That everyone is corrupted by a system, so you got to replace it with another system. It's Christians who are saying, no, we are fundamentally flawed in our basic nature. So what we need is not liberation, we need salvation and therefore a savior. And I think that's the missing point. So as Christians, we got to be really careful in terms of how we strategize. One of the key things I would say, and we kind of touched on that, is that it matters our faithful presence in culture, the cultural currency. I mean, it does matter, right? Our boys, I mean, our kids going out and seeing these flags, it's impacting them, whether we like it or not. What are Christian symbols out there in culture that they are learning from? And we have completely abandoned that space. There is no faithful presence in culture. We don't have any more cultural currency, even in
Yeah.
entertainment or whatever it might
Yeah.
be. We have
And even our
completely
churches
lost.
just look like office buildings, which is
Exactly.
a point that the Roman Catholics will often point out.
So we
So
need to have a return to a place where we recognize that uh, the basic nature of human being, what it is, and what is it that we truly need, and speak truth in light of that.
yeah, I think there is it's a good point. I think there's more actually out there that is explicitly Christian that we don't realize is
We don't
explicitly
amplify it.
Christian, and
Yeah,
we don't point it out, and that's a problem. So one of the things that I wanted to go into is to kind of help the Christian, both him or herself. Say you're a college student on campus, or maybe parents of high schoolers, parents of junior hires. What do you do? How do you engage? How do you react? Well, I think the question, what are you proud of, is a great place to start. And I think you need to ask this earnestly. You need to ask it, first of all, of yourself. What am I proud? One of the things that echoes in my mind is you ever get caught as a kid doing something wrong, or you broke a vase because you're right. And your mom comes to you. And what does she say? Well, I hope you're proud of yourself. And that's like, no, actually, I'm not proud, right? That's the worst thing that you could have done is I hope you're proud of yourself. Oh, no. So the question is, what are you proud of? What a child comes, mommy, these people just wanted to be, what are they proud about? And if you were to ask someone on campus, hey, you're celebrating Pride Month. Yeah. Well, tell me what it is you're proud of. I think that they may respond with something like, well, I'm proud to be who I am. I'm proud the way I'm made. And my follow-up question would be, you're made? Who made you? And why, in other words, how do you know that the way you're made is something that's appropriate to be proud of? Or are you just simply self-proud? I mean, and you do it in a loving way, but you can coax out a conversation by asking these questions that really will start to make people think. Because ultimately, there's no answer there other than I'm proud of the fact that I have desires and I get to act on them. That's the honest answer.
and I think there is a need. I mean, just an example. I think there's a need for us to return to a sense of biblical modesty. Why do I say that? Right? I mean, we have redefined modesty, and thereby we have abandoned or shunned what does it mean to be shameful. We need to understand that the idea of shame when it follows sin is a good thing. One must feel shameful, right? But there is a redemption available to come out of that. That's why we see what's happening through these ideologies is to extend the scope of not feeling shameful. That's what's happening. You got to remove the idea of shame from our psyche, from our culture, from our being. That's the very attempt. And the best way to do that is by expressing yourself the way you want to, sexually.
Well, and Jacob, again, that idea is explicit in queer theory.
Yeah.
And I'll take it's interesting that
It's the desensitized. It's the desensitized portion.
It was interesting because we were talking about how the homosexual lobby used the media, the strategy of the media to sort of engulf, you got to engulf the culture in propaganda 24/7 all the time so that, it just becomes the social imaginary or whatever term you want to use. It's interesting that some of the early critical theorists, the guys who coined the term, they were actually worried about that. They were worried about the ever tightening web of socialization. Adorno talks about this in his sociological work. But then, of course, they would talk about the entertainment industrial complex, in the media. And, now, of course, they were thinking in terms of like National Socialist, Nazi fascism, because that's what they had escaped. But it's still being done, right? Even if it's for a different cause, the mechanism is the same, even if the cause is slightly different. But, one thing that when it comes to this idea of shame, I mean, that is explicit. One of the explicit portions of Marcuse's seminal work, Eros and Civilization, right? Where he's trying to wed Freud and Marx. And he says, look, there are two arbitrary constructions in human history that have to be basically undone so that we can experience this new liberation into what he calls a libidinal rationality. Okay, where we can become the polymorphous perverse creatures we were always that we originally were before we evolved rationality. And the one thing is capitalism, the whole capitalist structure where you subliminate your libidinal energies into the work, into labor. And the other is the religiously imposed yet contingent idea of guilt and shame, that there are such things. There, for Marcuse, these are totally arbitrary constructions in human history, and they just need to be undone. And once they're undone, and this is his sort of early version of transhumanism, he talks about it's crazy. Like the end of that book is like, he thinks we'll experience time if we have sort of polymorphous perverse where we can walk around like animals and just experience each other with whoever we want, whenever we want, so long as the urge is there. He thinks we're going to experience time differently. I mean, it gets really weird and mystical, and that it's super spiritual, right? And I think that's why we also want to just that is what we're up against. It's not secular here. It's deeply spiritual. As you've often related, it mirrors a lot of Hindu thought and practice, right?
And we did a series, not a series, but a recent podcast on yoga. It's no coincidence that it emphasizes animal posture, and no one kind of connects that. There's that oneness with the creation, the creation itself, right? Being one with the nature, including the animal being, because we are one of them and with the same essence of the ultimate reality. So how could it be that we can suppress that animal nature? We're not supposed to do that. We're supposed to basically be enlightened through it by making it prominent.
Well, and Augustine said it pretty simply: the further man moves away from God, the more he becomes like an animal. Right? I can't remember if that's in City. I can't remember exactly where that is, but I know he said it. Logan, I want to touch on this briefly before we wrap up, because this is something that you wrote about a couple years ago now. But I was listening to a podcast with Larry Alex Taunton and Eric Metaxas, and they were talking about Eric Metaxas's letter to the American church. They were trying to sort of pinpoint, where did the church really start to slip recently in sort of giving up the fight on some of these moral issues, and just becoming sort of more and more political, but political in sort of a very liberal direction, right? And one of
I'd say a secular direction,
but I'm Logan and I, we did this on the radio the other day. I think we got two versions of Christianity basically just competing with each other. One is a biblical version. The other is sort of a repackaged Hegelian kind of Christianity where, God is unfolding in time and everything can kind of be a kind of assumed up into a very vague Christian sort of worldview. But one of the people that Larry Alex Taunton and Eric Metaxas mentioned was Tim Keller. And this, Metaxas says, it was very hard for him to deal with. And I guess he mentions Keller in the book because, of course, him and Keller were friends. They were both in New York. Keller wrote the foreword to Metaxas's Bonhoeffer book, which was probably his best book. But, we talked about this. There was a time, and what Metaxas said, and I thought this was basically correct, because Tim Keller did so much good work, so much good apologetics work. He was a good pastor. I think he was a decent man at the end of the day, and somebody who will definitely see in heaven. But Metaxas's point was the culture shifted dramatically, and Keller did not shift his apologetics along with the culture. And you kind of we kind of talked about this a couple of years before he died. We kind of felt that, and we weren't, we weren't the only ones pointing this out. There were others like Metaxas, and, that there was this attempt, I think, by guys like Keller, and they were doing it well, maybe worked in the 90s and maybe even the early 2000s, to sort of like work with the culture, right? To sort of touch base, find the touch points, be winsome with the broadly atheistic, but maybe not yet fully anti-Christian or explicitly anti-Christian culture. But there is, to me, there is a sense, in one of the terms that's getting thrown out there, I think Aaron Wren coined it, is, we're in this the negative culture. Okay, so, I mean, Pride Month, to bring it back to where we started, I don't think people who are organizing Pride events, who are running the agenda, I don't think it's like they haven't heard of Christianity before. I mean, the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence were invited to perform at the Dodgers game last year. Okay, they use explicitly biblical imagery in their performances. Okay, this is not like, oh, we've never heard of Jesus. This is something very different. So I don't, again, it's not to judge Keller too harshly, but Metaxas's point was just, the culture has taken some kind of far more radical shift in the last 10 years, maybe, that Keller
Tony,
maybe didn't quite catch up with.
Yeah, you touched on this. I mean, they're looking for liberation, and liberation is through the way of revolution. And you can't have revolution unless you are revolting against someone.
Yeah.
So when you're seeing this, it's not that they're ignorant. They're very much aware as to who their opponents are.
Yeah.
And they're revolting against that. And in so doing, they find more grounds.
To use a quote from Batman, from Bane, victory has made you weak, something like that. Like, there was a point at which, like, the American project was successful. Like, it won the day. It became a country. It had pretty much, in all cases, has a dominant force in the world. It kind of has just like, you have some rough periods, but it has just like, it just won the world wars. It was a land where people came to and succeeded, right? It was kind of like leave, people could leave. My family, they left, Italy, or they left Russia, or they left, Europe, and they came to the US, and they started with nothing. And then they got a bunch of cool things, like the blessings, like with family and school and education. And like, the American enterprise is like extremely successful, unheard of in human history, I would argue. And there's a point at which, with that enterprise of a very successful Protestant enterprise, you kind of like get to the point where you think like the whole like Aslan side of Christianity is just pointless. Like, the whole reason for David to be a king, and the whole like struggle over there, and the whole like, when we like to think of God as like a really cool dude that we'll go to the beach and like have s'mores with. And you're like, well, yeah, but there's also like, the overthrow of like Zeus, and, that sort of like, dramatic imagery of like Christ destroying the pagan gods. Like, it required immense sacrifice, immense bloodshed, immense questions of like, are we just all going to die, or are we going to stand for something that we think is true? Like, we forget all of the sort of the blood, sweat, and tears that created this sort of quasi-utopia. And then we kind of think like, oh, like the people who kind of harken back to the days of sacrifice, they're just the war-torn, gross Christians. And you're like, well, like David's like kind of a guy that's after God's own heart, and he had to bear the sword. And so it's like, so I think where we went wrong is where we just assumed that like, just God isn't belligerent. Like, we just assumed that, you can live however you want generally, and God will bless you. It's like, well, maybe, or it's like, maybe there was a time when Christians made such great sacrifices that the blessings continued for generations and generations. Like it speaks in the Bible. Like, there is possibility that there are good enough sacrifices that you're blessed for a long time. So it's almost like in our blessings, we've forgotten like the cost to have those blessings. And we'll probably have one generation that has to fight it by themselves. And it's going to be like horrifying. You'll probably get attacked by the church for defending things like having children and having a family, and, saying like, trying to like mutilate children's body. Like, you're going to, like Chechen, you'll have seen and believed, right? You have to defend these things, and you'll be attacked. And then hopefully the next generation will kind of wake up, I guess. I don't know if it plays out any other way, but that's my comment on Keller's. I think he was highly successful,
Well,
and he didn't realize that
Lenny,
what was the next wave was evil.
yeah. Yeah, Lenny, I mean, maybe we haven't fully tried to give any more like practical, what might, so the Keller approach, the winsome approach, a lot of people would say that's not, we did a podcast on this a while ago. That's just not really functional anymore. So give us some more, give us some ideas on how does the Christian, what should we do during Pride Month? People have come up with things like Fidelity Month, which is going around.
Yeah, Robert George.
I don't know if these Christian or at least broadly theistic responses, I don't know how much counter effect that they actually have or not. Maybe that's too early or too hard to gauge. But I don't know. Any other thoughts on than just this idea of, well, what do we do? And how do we?
Well, I think for parents, you have to instill specific values. And if you're going to be proud of anything, be proud of your exercise, say, of the spiritual gifts. It is one thing to be proud that you consumed a dozen donuts in 5 minutes. It's another thing to say, I didn't consume any donuts, even though they were laying in front of me. Self-control is much harder, and therefore it's much more worthy of carrying pride. Pride in a good sense, the idea that the good has been achieved. And we got to be a little bit careful, because the word pride, of course, in Scripture is usually in a negative sense, because it usually does refer to self-pride, self-aggrandizement. But self-debasement, or not self-debasement, that's not necessarily right, but self-denial, that's something that you can hold yourself up as virtuous. Virtues are those things to which we should aspire, and you are rightly confident by exercising those virtues. So when a parent talks to a child about Pride Month, she says, the thing you need to be proud of most is not the proclivities that you got other people to stop bugging you against, but that the desires that you had to overcome in order to be a good person, in order to reflect Jesus in your life and in their lives. The rich young ruler was very proud, right? These things all have I done since my youth. I've kept all the laws. But there's one thing you lack. Sell all that you have. Follow me. And he went away sad, because the one thing he couldn't do was deny himself. So there's an example of where pride fails. And I think that's what we have to just underscore and realize in that example, I've not talked about sexuality at all.
Yeah.
I've talked about the root problem underneath it, because Pride Month isn't simply a failing of our culture homosexuality. It's a failing of our culture self-control. And that can be exercised in any number of ways, be it transgenderism, be it fat, body acceptance approaches. Pick your grievance study, to say, girl power, for example. What does girl power mean? Why are you divorcing yourself from at least 50% of the population when you do that kind of thing? What is your actual motivation there? So I think that's what we have to do, is we have to underscore, so that they understand and associate when they hear the term pride, what are they really talking about? Because the best way I've ever seen this kind of thing unravel is when we define the words that the left is using very explicitly, show why they're corrupt, And then what happens is the left say, you're taking those words and twisting them. So woke is a good example. Or liberal. Remember about 10 years ago, all the commercials for political candidacy came out and all the Republicans are saying, he's a liberal. Now, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that would have been a badge of honor on the Democratic side. But you start saying it in debates, he's a liberal. Those are liberal policies. In the 2010s, that was a kiss of death. Why? Because we defined it to mean exactly what they weren't saying, but they actually meant to do. Woke is another word that we've seen that we've been able to take from the left and say, here's what it exactly means, because they don't want to define it. If you were to ask them to define it, they would give you wiggle words. Evolution is another example if you really, on the scientific side, try and parse it. But I think that's what we need to do with pride. I think we need to diffuse it by defining it and exposing it as self-aggrandizement, self-pleasure, selfishness. And once you equate pride with selfishness, Pride Month goes away.
Well, it's certainly selfish. And the idea of restraint and self-control are not, I mean, those are that if there was one
that's antithetical to June.
where it'd be like, you know, a civilization and a culture that has no self-restraint, that has no self-control is utterly doomed. You know, it's just doomed. And it's a civilization ending kind of thing. And I don't think it's exaggerating to say so, to say that this is a civilization ending kind of thing. Right? Because it doesn't lead to life, right? It doesn't lead to life.
Well, there are those who would point to Rome and say, look what happened there.
Yeah.
Or ancient Greece or whomever.
And let's also, put the blame where it is. Also, just we can't escape the fact that the boomers abandoned the institution, the boomers abandoned the culture, the boomers abandoned a generation. They taught them in a wrong manner, not the right ways. And what we are seeing today with this generation is an outcome of that. How about we, repent of that, come before the Lord and say, Lord, teach us your ways so that we can actually pass on a heritage worth having.
Yeah, and Jacob, I should say, since we've done a lot of evaluation and I think we've condemned the things that are worth condemning. I'll just say for my own part, I mean, as somebody who fell into all of the sins of my generation, right? The Generation X, and all the stuff that was going on in the, late 80s, early 90s. It's powerful. The culture you live in has power over you, right? Most people are going to go the way of the culture. And I pray for these, some of these students that I have that are young men, right? Either in high school or going off to college, because not only do they have to deal with the natural impulses that we all have towards sin and selfish desire, but because it's now so celebrated, they really, and also it's so ubiquitous given our technology. I mean, this is qualitatively different than in me at 48 years old than the culture I grew up in, where we didn't have internet. I got my first cell phone at 24, right? And it didn't have like video, right? It was, and I think I sent my first email my freshman year of college. And so it's hard.
There was actually a risk for pornography, right? You had to sneak to the back of the liquor store and try and boost the Playboy.
Or they'd be behind the black. They'd be behind the black. Well, how do I?
The guy in the trench coat who has to go to the adult bookstore, and he may actually be seen. Now there's no risk. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it is a compounding of sin, and the means to be tempted are extravagant. Right. And everything is that, and so much sin is just celebrated now. And that makes it hard. That makes it difficult for the person not growing up in the church to not deviate from the norm even that much more further than they otherwise would. And it's extremely hard on people in the church as well. So, it's difficult because when we get down to the individual person, right, we're talking about ideas here. And I know I get a little heated. I always say attack the ideas, never attack the people holding them. But, and sometimes that can get hard not to do. But, when we're, Logan, just,
I don't know if I entirely agree with that,
hard.
But
yeah.
well, it's
but,
if they have bad ideas,
church,
I don't know.
I would attack.
I'm just saying some of these ideas are like
Jesus,
we're gonna destroy your children. Like sometimes those people need to be attacked.
Yeah,
Like, I don't know. I know that's
I
like
understand that.
I don't know.
Especially if they are
watching.
if-
It's the
especially,
moms
Logan,
at schools that are on the
especially
forefront of
if
fighting.
they
And,
are-
like, what are we doing?
Logan, it's like Jesus loves the sinner, but he hates the sin. But still, he
But
sends
you
the
will cast the
sinners
sinner
to
to hell forever, right?
Yeah.
It's like okay, well,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well,
like
I'm talking
I don't want
about
to be that guy. I'm just like
in an evangelistic sense. When you meet some young person struggling with
well,
a sexual
it's important.
struggling with their, we get it. We're going to meet
Yeah.
them where they're at. But I will say, Logan, yes, there are certain people that I would have a greater amount of righteous indignation, condemnation for. Like, for example, the people doing the transgender surgeries and making money off of it. Okay, I'm going to have a lot less mercy and grace towards them than the kid who's confused and going in and thinking that this is going to liberate them from their existential crisis, or anybody who is presenting themselves as a Christian or part of the church and facilitating this kind of evil. Yeah, for sure.
Well, it's kind of reopening, and maybe that's the practical, like the most fundamental, practical, very simple. I think anyone can do is ask the question. So what I just said, when you had, the idea of like, hate the sin but not the sinner, like asking yourself, in your mind, is there a category of actions, things, people, animals, or whatever that deserve to be like physically stopped? Just like broadly speaking, and you might go, oh yeah, the guy who's trying to kill me. Go, okay, but like, is it just that guy? And just dwell on it. Like, are there like enemies that, and not all of them, like it requires wisdom. Like on the schoolyard, like, you had to figure these things out. Like, who are your friends? Who are your enemies? Who are like too scared and would lie to you because they're afraid? Who is lying to you because they're trying to take your money? Like, you got to figure all that out. But I think we sort of shut out like the idea of like, oh, like there's no one out there that really wants to do me harm. And I'm saying, well, I don't know. We're reading their books. We're seeing what they're doing. We're seeing their consequences. Like, at what point does that category in your mind open up? Like, oh, there's people who don't like who I am, and they're going to try to get my kids. Like, if that doesn't exist, think about why. Maybe it should. Maybe it shouldn't. Like, dwell on that, and it might change your life. I don't know.
Well, it was, I meant when we had the interview with Clay Jones, talking about the conquest of the Canaanites, but I put it this way, if anything, we have an underdeveloped sense of justice right now on the conservative side of things. Conservative Christians may very well have an underdeveloped sense of justice, and they need to grow a sense of justice, right? Because the things that are, and I did mention this briefly in the new book, that if this is the darkest side of our culture now, is the sexualization of children, right? And if you can't get your sense of justice worked up over that, then I don't know what you're going to get your sense of justice worked up over. Your sense of righteous indignation and anger. There's a place for anger, and we should certainly be.
Well, I think that's why Sound of Freedom was so good, because it was sort of a flashpoint to see how bad it was. Some people did get upset, and they kind of resonated with that sense of justice in the movie, and there were some people who responded by publishing these articles, essentially defending the entire atrocity. And you got to realize, like, if nothing else, use that as a flashpoint to realize, like, there are people who can see tragedy of children and be like, oh, it's just misunderstood. It's really not that bad. And those are the people you need to realize and be like, okay, do I need a new category in my mind that those people who are in the media or in high places of power, they fit into that category? They're not just on Epstein's Island, right? Like, presumably none was convicted, so they're off the island.
Yeah. Well, and I think that is part of Metaxas's critique as well in that book. He's saying, like, there are a lot of good Germans who were, willing to just turn a blind eye or make excuses or claim ignorance to utterly wicked and vile, grotesque and radical evil that was going around them. And I think we need to realize the radicalness of the evil that is around us. And Pride Month, I think, is exemplifies that. I think it does. It does. And that's why I'm not going to go. I don't want to go look at it because I don't even want to see it, but I'll certainly try and fight it. We're certainly going to try and fight against it. As best we can by the grace of God. All right, gentlemen. Well, it's been an interesting discussion. One I wish we didn't have to have, but one that needed to be brought up, and hopefully it will resonate. So thank you guys. We'll see you next time.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.